Okay, y'all. This is the second part of the reform movement unit that we're going to talk about. Remember last week we talked about the Second Great Awakening, which was a religious movement that pushed people to try and change society. And then we talked about how Dorothea Dix changed the prison systems from being kind of an inhumane place of treating slaves and mentally ill people into a much better life for prisoners. Today we're going to talk about three different movements. We're going to talk about the education reform movement. We're going to talk about women's rights movement, and then we're going to talk about the temperance movement. So we'll start with education reform. So here we go. So back in the 1800s, there was no public education, free public education. So where we go to Jefferson, you don't have to pay to go there, and everyone has a right to go there that lives within our school's boundaries. Back then, that didn't really occur. There are very few public schools, and if they were, you couldn't really go for free. You had to pay. So most of the schools were private schools that only wealthy families could send their kids to. The poor or even the middle class families couldn't really send their kids. I don't want to generalize anything, but just think of private school would be like Mazzucchelli, where you had to pay money to go to. All right, whereas at Jefferson, it's free. So back during then, there was no free schools. Predominantly, all schools you had to pay to go to, like Mazzucchelli. Um, Schools in the cities and in the frontier or in the country were different. In the country or in the frontier, there was one school room. So essentially, just think of one building for all ages of children. All right, so you could have kindergartners mixed in with kids that were 13 years old. Typically, when you get to that 12 to 13-year-old age, kids will stop going to school because they need to go work on the farm and help people out. Oftentimes these teachers in the frontier, they were not very educated themselves, so it would be like a teacher that is not educated teaching you. So it was not the best environment. If you remember during the Industrial Revolution, we talked about how children in the cities were committing a lot of crimes and being sent to jail. Um, Reformers believed that if we were to get these kids out of the factories and into schools, um, that the crime would go down with these guys. So by getting these kids into an educational system, their crime would go way down. The person who's going to spark this education movement is a guy named Horace Mann. Horace Mann is going to be the leading person during this time. So think of him as the Dorothea Dix of the education movement. When he was a boy, he only went to school for about 10 weeks out of the year. Typically, we go to school for about 27 to 30 weeks a year today. So he's about a third of the time that we go to school. As he grew older, he believed that all children should receive a free education. I'm not going to read this whole quote, but he thinks that if we get these kids into an education system, they'll be more skillful and they'll be more educated. They'll get better jobs and they'll help the country as a whole. So eventually, Horace Mann's going to have to convince people to pay for taxes, to build better schools, to pay teachers, and to also provide training for teachers to make them better. So Horace Mann really led this revolution in the education system. Who could not go to school during this time? Um, Most higher level schools, like a high school or college, did not accept girls. All right, so if you were a girl, you could not really go to high school or college. In the South, African American children were not allowed to go to school. It was just white people. Eventually, they would be allowed to go to school, but then they would be in segregated schools. So that means you would have a school for the white, and you have a school for the blacks, and typically the students or the schools with all white kids had better teachers, better schools, better resources, whereas the African American schools had worse or uneducated teachers, less resources, less facilities. So the pictures on the right I have here are pictures of white men or white boys. These would be the ones who went to school. Um, and yeah, so eventually there's going to be a college called Oberlin College in 1837. It will be the first college to allow women. And then about 20 or 30 years later, then you're going to start seeing public colleges allow women. So these would be state schools start to allow women into the education field in college. The woman by the name of Prudence Crandall is going to be one of the first people to kind of help Horace Mann with all this kind of stuff. She created a school that allowed African Americans into her school. When she did this, the white parents removed her kids from the school. So she created a school just for African American children. And at that time, she was locked away in jail and she was forced to close her school. So Prudence Crandall kind of shows you guys the things that were not good about education in the 1800s, how African Americans couldn't be there, and then even if she had a school just for African Americans, she was still locked away. The next movement we're going to talk about is women's rights. We talked about how they were valued more in the factories in the Industrial Revolution because they didn't get paid the same amount as men. That's not equal rights, right? They're not getting paid the same amount. Also, women were not allowed to vote for themselves. They couldn't. They didn't have very many rights, especially in comparison to their husbands. Also, women were really focusing on abolishing slavery, which we'll talk about in the third week next week. So the leader of this women's rights movement is going to be a woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Okay, as a young girl, she saw women ask her father for help because her father was a judge, and the women would go to her father and be like, "Look, he's beating me up." But really, there was no law against it. There was no domestic violence laws like there is today. Um, so he was not really able to help. Uh, and this really is going to start to spark her movement to helping out women and get more rights. Eventually, she's going to meet a woman named Lucretia Mott at an anti-slavery or an abolitionist conference, and they're going to realize that at this conference, women weren't allowed to be even in the meetings. So they're like, this is not fair. We need to fight for women's rights. So the abolitionist movement, which we'll talk about next week, really starts to spark this women's rights movement as well. Some things that were not equal, all right, is women could not speak in public. So like say there was a town hall meeting or like say there's like the leaders of the Dubuque had a meeting on something, like they're talking about building Five Flags Center back up and rehabbing it and things like that. Women would not be allowed to speak in those meetings if the same laws existed today. Also, they are often considered unqualified for certain schools or jobs, even though they had the same education as men. So if a man and a woman were going up for the same job and they had the same education, back then the man would get the job every time because they would be deemed, women would be deemed unqualified. I really like this picture. This kind of symbolizes a man and a woman who both look like they're high up in their positions and they probably have very similar jobs. But this shows that the men have way more money or make more money than the women. And that's something that still actually exists to this day. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her friend Mott are going to create a convention or say like a meeting or conference of women's rights in this place called Seneca Falls, New York. It's in July 19th and 20th of 1848. So essentially you're going to get a bunch of women together as well as some Quakers and African American men, and they're all going to get together and they're going to talk about women's rights and try and push for things that they can do to try and get more rights for women. At the Seneca Falls Convention, they create this document called the Declaration of Sentiments. Okay, kind of sounds a lot like a document we talked about at the very beginning of the year, which was the Declaration of Independence. Remember, that was the breakup letter with England. We tell England and King George we're no longer going to be a part of their country and we're going to break away because they're doing things that are unjust. Now, the women aren't going to really say we're going to break away from the men, but they're going to list those grievances or complaints. And some of those were the right to vote, which they did not have. They could not own property, so women could not own land back then. And they could not practice being a lawyer or a doctor. And these are just a few of the complaints that they listed in the Declaration of Sentiments. So what happens is they fill it out just like the Declaration of Independence, and then the women of the convention, you can see in this picture kind of at the bottom, sign it, just like we saw the founding fathers do during the Declaration of Independence. So one thing was the women's right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the Seneca Falls Convention says that the women should argue that they need the right to vote, but most of the women at the time thought that that was asking too much. Like, we need to go baby steps, and she's like, no, we need to get the right to vote. A guy that we'll talk about more in depth next week, his name is Frederick Douglass. He's going to really come out. He's going to be there. He's an African American abolitionist. And he's going to say that all people should have the right to vote, white or black, man or woman. So he and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are really going to work together on this. Here is a picture of Frederick Douglass right here with the women of the convention. All right, this is a statue. So what was the outcome of the women's rights movement? Elizabeth Cady Stanton eventually will kind of take a step back after this. She'll continue to write speeches, but she won't really give the speeches. She'll give these speeches to a new woman that we'll talk more about named Susan B. Anthony, and she would go around the United States reading the speeches. Another African American abolitionist, her name is Sojourner Truth. She will also campaign around the United States like Susan B. Anthony, and slowly but surely women will start to get to more rights, okay? They will be able to start to own property, and they will start to become doctors and lawyers and things like that. However, that right to vote is going to take forever. All right, we're talking about the 1800s. The right to vote is not going to happen until the 1920s. All right, so that is the women's rights movement. And we have a few more slides here. The last movement is called the temperance movement. Okay, the temperance movement is all about ending the sale and the consumption or the drinking of liquor. Okay, this is in the 1830s, so this is not prohibition when they do ban liquor, because that's not going to officially happen for a while. But this is where women and abolitionists are really going to focus on trying to get their husbands and men in society to stop drinking and to not be able to buy liquor. The reason being, and it's in the second bullet point right here, is because they believe that when men got drunk, they beat their wives and they lost their family's money on gambling. And so it caused lots of problems. So they're trying to change society by getting rid of the domestic violence and the gambling, which is going to ruin families' money income. Continuing with the temperance movement, many women and religious leaders started the movement to end alcohol. They created different societies that helped try and stop the consumption of alcohol, and they did a pretty good job. All right, so consumption of alcohol will drop in the 1800s under the women, under the temperance movement, sorry, but it won't officially stop drinking, okay? Drinking can still be bought. Eventually, in the 1920s, there's going to be this thing called prohibition, and that's when the federal government actually ends the sale of alcohol. That lasts for about 10 years. So this prohibition era really starts with the temperance movement. I really like this picture in the middle here. It's a bunch of women that say, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. Meaning if you're drinking, we will not be married to you or kiss you or things like that. So today we covered a lot of content really quickly. We talked about education reform, how we need to open up free public education for everyone. We talked about women's rights at the Seneca Falls Convention, where they argue they don't have the same rights and they need more rights. And we talked about the temperance movement, um, which tried to end the sale and the drinking of alcohol or liquor. The rest of your lesson for today is a lot more, I think, engaging than the rest of, or than last week. You're going to do one of those tacos activities where you break down a political cartoon. You'll do a web quest where you search the internet for certain answers to certain questions. And then you'll listen to a song from the temperance movement and answer questions on that. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.